Hey, what I have here is a tabletop. Made this 2011. Anyway, Wenge and Holly spiderweb. Right, there's a little black widow right here. Marquetry. Her name's Morticia. Anyway, this thing develops these little white streaks. I don't know if it shows up on camera. There's one there, some around here, a little bit right there. Anyway, this needs to get stripped. I don't remember if this was conversion varnish or catalyzed lacquer, but regardless, the finish has to come off. So I'm going to sand it, and yeah, we'll see how it goes. That is so bizarre. I don't know what that is. It's coming out. So I was testing the finish to see if it's conversion varnish or lacquer, catalyzed lacquer, pre-cat lacquer. And as I'm putting this lacquer thinner on there, I thought it won't really melt the finish because those finishes cure. If it's regular lacquer, then it will melt it. If it's a catalyzed lacquer, that should be catalyzed and it's almost impervious to lacquer thinner, but it still does affect it a little bit and you can tell that it's doing something. But in conversion varnish, the lacquer thinner wouldn't even do anything to it. But it's actually taking that white out of there, so this might not go into my sanding video. I don't know. That is awesome. That came right out. It probably doesn't show on camera. Let me see. Yeah, see this spot right there? Okay, lacquer thinner. And I know it's making the finish dull, but I can lightly scuff this, wipe it down with lacquer thinner, and then respray it. But boom, gone. Wow, awesome. I was a little apprehensive to sand this down. It is a veneered. It's chops on veneer, so it's plenty thick, but you still run risk. However, that is coming out. That is awesome. That makes me happy. So what I'll do is I'll wipe this entire thing down once I get all that white out of the, I think it was, if it's wax, it could be a big problem because it could just fisheye when I go to respray it. But one thing at a time. So once I get all that white out, I'll wipe the entire thing down with lacquer thinner. And then I'll use Scotch-Brite or something fine to give it a little bit of scuff. And then boom. I can either put a seal coat, real light mist, maybe 2 of them. And that hopefully will seal any fisheye contaminant. Because contaminant from wax or grease, that'll cause fisheye. And if you don't know what fisheye is, it's these little areas of football shapes that develop all over where you have incompatibility between the finish and that wax or silicone, whatever it was. Furniture polishes are horrible. Furniture polish, Pledge, and all those, that's a refinisher's nightmare. So don't use them. That looks good, man. I mean, it has some dull areas from the lacquer thinner, but that doesn't scare me. Oh my gosh, that is fabulous.
Well, it seems good up to this point, but it turns out I did have to sand this.
I've wiped this several times. I've rubbed it kind of hard where the white spots were with lacquer thinner, and then I've wiped the entire thing down several times with more lacquer thinner. The areas that I rubbed really hard are pretty dull. I don't know if it shows up on camera, but they're pretty dull. Where the white spots were, that's dull. So now, Maroon 5 Scotch-Brite, or Maroon Scotch-Brite, and just with the grain, and the entire thing is getting dull.
This light scuff or sanding is known as tooth or bite. Give something for the top coat, something to adhere to. Makes sense, yeah?
This was an extremely challenging for me process to make these inlays. So essentially what I did is I made a 10-piece starburst with Wenge. That's pretty straightforward. And then I cut like this much of this piece and this piece, and those 2 pieces I did the marquetry spider on, and then did the marquetry spider on the background of the Wenge, glued that back into place. Once the starburst veneer was all glued down, Then I routed all the way across to make these straight lines for the spider web. That's like 1/16 pieces slipped in there. Once those are all in, I kind of flushed that up, barely, lightly sanding, and then came in, I had a jig with a router and cut these arcs. And it's interesting, these arcs are not the same radius. They had to turn into a smaller radius as they approached this, smaller and smaller and smaller, because this radius only being that long up here would look like a straight line. It's an optical illusion. So I had to make a larger radius here and gradually make tighter and tighter radiuses to where they appear to be the same, but they are dramatically different. This radius here is like that, and you can see just mimicking my hand how different it is from that radius to this one. But anyway, I learned a lot, fun project, and hopefully I can respray this and make it look fresh again. Well, as I started sanding it, it started developing some lighter areas where I was going through the finish, and this darker wenge that's a patina. And so this is more the natural color of the wood. So I just need to get the finish off and make sure I start from scratch. So it is what it is. Not a big deal. Sharp scraper, and I can take light passes to get that finish off. You can see as I get through the finish, it starts turning brown, which is the wenge, of course. So, not too bad.
To scrape a top coat type finish, you need a really fine edge, and you might check out my latest YouTube video called Card Scrapers. I talk all about that. The edges need to be honed to a mirror finish and a really light hook or burr.
It's a little tricky. You can hear the inlays of holly as I go across that. Just need to take it easy so the edge of my scraper doesn't grab one of those, because it's literally cross-grained.
All right, once most of that finish is removed, I break out the incomparable belt sander. Fine grit, started with a 180. Yeah, and this will just get everything nice and flat and consistent. Finish or lacquer tends to clog these belts quickly, so I'm just using older belts and changing them out frequently. The goal here is to get most of that off. Then I'll scrape one more time, and then we can finish sand. So I need to move on to these edges and this chamfer or bevel. You can see how how impossible it would be to hold that scraper consistently as I rotate around that compound curve. So let me show you this.
How crude is that? Wait a minute, let me change the verbiage. How effective is that? So we've got this pretty much sanded. I need to sand this edge and this chamfer, and I need to get the finish off. I don't want to sand that. It can get roundish, so I'm scraping it. So I literally just put a block of, I put my scraper, hold on. I put my scraper at an angle that I thought was appropriate. I put a small pencil mark on this chamfer, started scraping till the pencil started to disappear. I held that in place, grabbed a block of wood, laid it flat on here to determine an angle. It's arbitrary, it's 20 degrees. Made that cut with the bandsaw, slipped a screw in here, tightened that up, so it's pretty tight. But as I rotated, it would change, so I got it to where it was scraping evenly, held it still, marked the back, cut a couple of blocks that are that radius, and boom, look at that, perfect. You can see how the holly has ambered slightly, and I'm taking that lacquer off right to there. That's white, scraped flat, and it'll retain a nice crisp Eris. All I have to do is rotate it. Simple, quick, fabulous.
I love simple jigs like this that are effective and easy to make. Then I moved on to scraping the edge, and yes, I have to be careful here and just scrape through the finish and not contact the wood too much. Once I had most of the finish scraped, I could turn to this jig, and it has this curve. It's the same radius as the table, of course. It's nice and square. I added a couple of cleats, and with that, I can effectively sand this edge. Let me show you what I mean.
Okay, so this little strip of holly, that was cut into a rabbet right at the corner and then inlaid. And then of course this is veneer and this is veneer. So sometimes if you sand this too much, you'll expose the edge of that. Same with this, you can, those corners need to be right at that eris. And if they're not, then one veneer can show up, kind of like it's doing there.
You can kind of see the edge
of the veneer right there. And so what I can do is I can just sand that. I'm basically sanding that wenge down. Doesn't take much. I'll bring those points right where they line up. I need to do a little bit more, but you can see what I'm talking about. And I can just sand that till that is perfect. Kind of cool, yeah? At this stage, I have the edge scraped off the finish, and I sanded it. Now I can sand the top with a fresh 180, sand the entire thing. Of course, this belt, it's about a 4x6 footprint. It will migrate into these areas here, producing these diagonal scratches toward the center. I want to get it overall, that gets everything flat. That's why I want to start with the belt sander. Then I will finish with the Festool, this guy with also fresh 180, and that will remove all these diagonal scratches from the belt sander. This is a 3mm, so it's a pretty small swirl pattern. Once I get that done, that'll be to 180. That'll be plenty for a top coat type finish, and then I can throw a few coats down of catalyzed lacquer. So yeah, good progress.
A few things to notice here. I left the volume up so you could hear me goosing that throttle. It gives me a little bit more control. And also keep the sander moving, of course. And you'll notice that I let the front end hang over the edge right at the balance point, and that keeps the back wheel from digging in.
So I get a lot of people DMing or whatever, commenting about how they've always thought a belt sander is really just for rough work. Absolutely not. You can do the finest of work. Of course, this originally, when it was made, was sanded just like this with a belt sander. This is veneer. And did I go through? Nope. Refinishing, sanding again, did not go through. You don't have to put a rough belt on this. You can put a fine belt on it. And if your belt sander is tuned correctly, it can do extremely accurate work. This platen, that's the key to a sander sanding flat. This type of a sander here, even with a hard pad on it, when you reach the edge, it will round that slightly. This belt sander will not. And you can prove that by sanding a narrow board like this, put a straight edge across it, and you will see light right on the corners. The belt sander, everything stays nice and flat. And you can see with this last pass, there's very little finish accumulating on the belt. So I know I got it all off. If there's any little bit left, I'll be hitting it with the dual action now to eliminate any of these scratches. I'll bring in a low raking light to make sure, and we'll be ready for finish.
Okay, here's a little pro tip that I've shared before. So when you first put your paper on, roll it at about a 45-degree angle, and that kind of flares that edge a little bit, and it keeps it from digging in or producing swirl marks from the edges of the paper. And large circles or figure eights are my favorite. All right, so the best low raking light angle that you're going to get is by using the sun, right?
If I tip it up, it's dark on top of the table. I don't know if that shows up. There's a little divot right there. So what I can do, mark that with pencil. Right there, see this little piece of wenge missing? I don't know if I can sand that out, but I can probably fill that with a little sliver of wood. So I'll just mark that with an arrow. Just go over this entire thing, sand it, bring it back out and check it until it's absolutely perfect. I mean, Phil Morley style, perfect.
Let's fix this little missing chunk of wenge.
All right, got some super glue in there, and then of course hit it with the accelerator, activator. I use the medium, and I find that, so this is wenge, and I went with some walnut, which is a little bit lighter, because you'll notice how dark everything gets when you add glue to it. Got a shop-made domino that needed sanded anyway. Created some walnut sawdust, got it in there. So we'll let that sit a little bit, come back and sand it, see how it turned out.
Once I'm sure that that is fully cured, I have this sanding block, and I believe that's 220 grit, and I can just lightly sand that and sneak up on getting a nice flat surface. Zoomed in, you can see I need to go just a little bit more. At this point, I may find a few areas of the chamfer that need honed back just a tad.
All right, I believe that is it. I think this thing's ready to shoot. And I did want to point out one thing. So each one of these sections, there's 10 sections, and each one of these is actually 2 pieces of veneer open like a book matched all the way, you know. For instance, here there's a couple of knots right there where that book match is. And then also this grain continues out, and then I save these pieces so this grain continues down that waterfall, so it looks more harmonious, right? And book matching the grain that way, it really tends to accentuate these funnels as they, you know, come to a sharper point. So yeah, too fun. All right, so this top had some really weird light areas of wenge, and of course it can be hard to capture with a phone, but basically I just masked this bevel off, this holly.
Oh, and a curved shaped shield.
And then utilizing an airbrush with some red and brown dye, I just touched up those light areas, and it looks pretty good now. I mean, yeah, the color does not capture correctly on the phone, but it should do the trick. I can just now remove this. So what I did is I first put a seal coat, and then this concoction, red and brown dye mixed with some lacquer thinner, and then I needed a carrier or a binding agent, so I used just a little bit of lacquer. Should work.
I apologize for the format that I filmed this in. Wasn't really paying attention. Anyway, got a first coat on, and you know, a lot of people will use a grain filler to fill the pores in porous woods like wenge. Personally, I like that to show up, that characteristic of those pores. It looks more real to me, but you know, differences in opinion. That's just me. And that is it for this project. I sincerely hope you got some good use out of this video. And as always, thanks a ton for watching.